Fletcher, Thong, Fuentes, Furutani, Gaines, Galgiani, Garrick, Gatto, Gordon, Gorell, Grove, Hagman, Halderman, Hall, Harkey, Hayashi, Hernandez, Hill, Huber, Waso, Huffman, Jeffries, Jones, Knight, Lara, Logue, Lowenthal, Ma, Mansour, Mendoza, Miller, Mitchell, Monning, Morrell, Nistande, Nielsen, Norby, Olson, Pan, Perea, V. Manuel Perez, Portantino, Silva, Skinner, Smythe, Solorio, Swanson, Torres, Valadeo, Wagner, Wykowski, Williams, Imada. Mr. Speaker.
Okay, members, a quorum is present. We ask our guests and visitors in the rear of the chamber and in the gallery to please stand for the prayer. We ask Assembly Member Bradford to offer the day's prayer.
Thank you, Father. The light of your presence leads all humankind to truth, justice, liberty, and freedom. Grant us a share of the light of your countenance by guiding these elected representatives gathered here in legislating fair and wise for the greater good of all the people of the great state of California. In your name we pray. Amen.
We ask our guests and visitors to remain standing and join us for the flag salute. Please join Assembly Member Yamada of the 8th District as she leads us in the pledge. Ms. Yamada.
Thank you. Members, shall we begin? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may be seated. Reading of the previous day's journal.
Assembly Chamber, Sacramento, Monday, February 13, 2012. The Assembly met at 1 p.m. Honorable Fernando Mas, Speaker Pro Tem of the Assembly, Presiding Chief Clerk E. Dawson
Mr.
Wilson.
Calderon moves and Mr. Hagman seconds that the reading of the previous day's journal be dispensed with. Presentations of petitions, there are none. Introduction and reference of bills will be deferred. Reports of committees will be deemed read and amendments deemed adopted. Messages from the Governor, there are none. Messages from the Senate, there are none. Motions and resolutions. The absences for the day will be deemed read and printed in the journal. Mr. Calderon, you are recognized.
Yes, Madam Speaker and members, I request unanimous consent to waive the rules to allow Assembly members Alejo and Bronley and Furutani to have guests and photographers on the floor.
Without objection.
Also, request unanimous consent to suspend the rules to allow Assembly Member Jones to speak on adjourn in memory.
Without objection.
Pursuant to Rule 96, request unanimous consent to refer the following bills to committee. AB 1500 from the Budget Committee to the Revenue and Taxation Committee, and AB 1501 from the Budget Committee to the Higher Education Committee.
Without objection.
Back left, so if you want.
Members, we are now going to move to the Day of Remembrance observance, which marks the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II by taking up a special resolution. Without objection, we will move to file item number 5. Mr. Speaker, are you ready to proceed with this item? Mr. Speaker. Clerk will read.
Assembly concurrent resolution 104 by Assembly Member John A. Perez and others relative to a day of remembrance.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Speaker, members, I rise to present ACR 104, which declares Sunday, February 19th, as Day of Remembrance. I'm pleased to be joined by members of the Legislative Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus in bringing forward this resolution. Each of us are privileged to serve California, and as servants of the people, each of us took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California. In doing so, each of us took on a sober and solemn obligation to be active participants in the first of the Constitution's charges, to build a more perfect union. Of necessity, that means that we must remember those moments where our union was less perfect, where the actions of our leaders stood in contrast to our founding principles of liberty and justice. Today, we commemorate one of those moments and reaffirm our solemn obligation to use those lessons of the past to prevent the reoccurrence in the future. 70 years ago, on February 19th, Executive Order 9066 became a wartime law, which led to the incarceration of 120,000 American citizens and legal residents of Japanese ancestry during World War II. This was an action that echoed previous actions in wartime, in particular the actions of Cicero in a time of war when he believed that laws should fall silent. Cicero believed that Cicero's understanding takes on more poignancy given the challenges of our current era, that popular wisdom can be a force for positive change when it's founded from a place of hope, and that wisdom can be equally destructive when it comes from a place of fear. In an era where we have confronted fears stemming from a war, from economic calamity, these lessons take on a special significance. Fear of the other becomes a powerful actor, and when it does, any group that could possibly be seen as not entirely American can become a target of suspicion and hostility. In those days after Pearl Harbor, it was fear that culminated in Executive Order 9066 by President Roosevelt, a decision supported by then California Attorney General Earl Warren. Two men who today are revered for taking critical steps towards building the irreversible momentum for the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s were responsible for a gross injustice on loyal citizens of the United States. This was a bipartisan sin against our Constitution. That is something that we are all clearly understanding today. Every forced relocation, every item of property seized, every vandalized business and home was a crime against justice. In places where Japanese Americans lived, certainly in the three remaining historic Japantowns in San Jose and San Francisco and Little Tokyo in my district, loyal Americans subtly had their loyalties questioned and posters and proclamations commanding them to assemble for internment. These posters were everywhere throughout California, in places like Fruit Ridge Road here in Sacramento, or in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles where my mother grew up. The men and women who saw these signs in LA were told to assemble at the Old Union Church. A place of worship became the house of injustice. For thousands of Japanese Americans, that church became a symbol of fear and injustice, as did the Santa Anita racetrack, where those loyal Americans were forced to sleep in stables as they awaited transportation to places that now haunt our memories, like Tule Lake and Manzanar. Those camps still stand today as desolate reminders of a shameful moment of our past. Millions of loyal American citizens were forced to confront the brutal reality that the United States has its share of moments where our actions conflict with our founding ideals. California is certainly no stranger to those moments. We see examples through our history: our role in the Chinese Exclusion Act, the repeal of the Rumford Fair Housing Ordinance, and certainly most starkly, the internment of Japanese Americans. And that's why we must take these opportunities for us to reflect on the past. It's because we make an active effort to remember our history as we strive towards justice that makes us look back on these events in an earlier California with shock and with disdain and with regret. Despite actions that conflicted with the ideals for which we fought in World War II, thousands of Japanese American young men joined our military, fought with distinction, and contributed to our victory. From their example, we're reminded that the ties that bind us together as a people are resilient and strong. That lesson is strengthened by a former member of this body, Ralph Dills. Alone amongst his colleagues, he spoke out against this injustice. He lost his seat in his next election because he stood on principle. And yet he reclaimed that seat later, not because he recanted his views, but because hope replaced fear in the hearts of Californians, and we recognized the injustice of our previous actions. There are examples of why we can today reaffirm our commitment to those sacred obligations enshrined in the words and the concept to form a more perfect union. Members, I respectfully ask for an aye vote on this resolution, and I ask that the first roll call be open for co-authors.
Mr. Furutani.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Members, I rise in support of ACR 104. I want to thank the Speaker for such an eloquent presentation of this resolution that we do pretty much every year. All of us in our communities and our families have touchstones, things that we return to sort of orient ourselves, to recenter ourselves. A lot of them are historical periods, a lot of them are personal. In the case for Japanese Americans, the issue of going to camp during World War II is one of those touchstones, one of those stories talked about when families get together, when people meet, and eventually through a course of discussion ask the question, what camp was your family in? I myself was not born in camp. I was born after camp. But my father was a part of a community in the Southern California area, San Pedro, and he lived in a place in the port called Terminal Island. Terminal Island at that time was a tuna fishing village, a Japanese fishing village, one where the Japanese community had brought a technical advance in fishing to the tuna industry, thus became a part of this thriving industry at that time. On December 7th, when the World War II started with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 48 hours were given to all Japanese Americans that lived on Terminal Island to get off the island and only being able to take what you could carry with you. It's one of those issues relative to a dark chapter in history, but it's also one of those situations which put in a context and a perspective. What I mean by that is after being forced off and out of their homes in Terminal Island, my father's family had to find housing, and they lived in the Norwalk area. And then on the infamous February 19th, when Executive Order 9066 was ordered, and all Japanese, anybody 1/16 of their background being Japanese, were forced out of the Western Defense Zone and put into camps. My father's family was put in a camp in the swamps in Arkansas, first in an area called Roar that was then closed, and they went to Jerome, Arkansas. But an interesting phenomenon was that my mother, who's from the Elk Grove area, right here, but a short distance from the capital, after they were forced into camp, although from Northern California, they also went to Arkansas. So the bad news, obviously, was the fact that they ended up in Arkansas. But had this not happened, and my father from Terminal Island in San Pedro, Southern California, not met my mother from Elk Grove in Northern California, you would have an empty microphone here. So it's a matter of looking at history from a lot of different angles. Our caucus asked the Speaker to present the ACR today because of the community he represents. He has one of the largest remaining Little Tokyos or Nihonmachi or Japan towns in his district and is represented well, and they all view him as their champion and friend. But in this particular situation with this, I wanted to end my comments by acknowledging the California legislature. The legislature has been always open to looking at many issues in many communities, but in this particular one, the establishment of the Day of Remembrance as a regular situation and resolution that we do with every year. If you remember last year, we also passed a bill establishing the first ever Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution. That was a day that acknowledged an individual that challenged the constitutional decision that this was okay to put Japanese Americans and American citizens in camp. We also passed a bill that conferred college diplomas on Japanese Americans who were forced out of their college experience because of being incarcerated. But there's been one last debate, interestingly enough, in the Japanese American community relative to this episode. And it's all been about words, terminology. So the term you've heard, internment camp, relocation center, people in the Japanese American community are saying, and they're backing it up with all kinds of different information, memos, etc., historically based, that say that they use the term concentration camp. My perspective has always been, when you're looking at something to try to determine how to define it, there's at least two perspectives. One, those on the outside looking in, and two, those on the inside looking out. And oftentimes you may be looking at the very same phenomena, but the decisions and the conclusions and the terminology used to define it can be diametrically opposite. So although used as a political spin, internment camp relocation center, a lot of people in the camps called them concentration camps. So when you talked about being interned in camp, if you were the internee, they talk about incarceration. They talk about being in prison. So it is a matter of perspective. There was the debate with the Jewish American community that turned out very positive about the use of the term concentration camp. That term has become a pretty regularly used term relative to the Japanese American experience, because the same question presented to the Jewish community again. From the outside looking in, it might have looked like a concentration camp. From the inside looking out, a lot of Jewish Americans I know call them death camps. So a matter of perspective, but a perspective that our legislature has been open to and has championed to make sure that this chapter, along with many other important chapters, are not forgotten and in fact learned from. Thank you very much.
Ms. Skinner.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I also stand in support of ACR 104, and I thank the Speaker and the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus for bringing it forward. I am a very proud resident of my hometown, Berkeley, which played a very strong role in keeping this remembrance around this horrendous act against Japanese Americans. Two little stories I'll share with you. For those of you familiar with the city of Berkeley, there's a street that runs north-south, Sacramento Street, and it's kind of a dividing line, and it used to be referred to as the Mason-Dixon line. And everyone who lived west of Sacramento Street, not everyone ever, but rather mostly the residents west of Sacramento were non-Caucasian. So it was dominantly African-American neighborhoods, but there were many of our Japanese-American residents in those neighborhoods west of Sacramento Street. And when the internment occurred, it was our African-American residents that protected the homes of the Japanese-Americans who were interned, so that when they returned home, there was really a home still there for them. And very, very few Berkeley Japanese-American residents lost their home. Later, as Japanese-American residents of Berkeley began to be much more demonstrative about the horrendous experience of Japanese Americans and the importance of all of us acknowledging it, they were some of the people that led the fight for both the Day of Remembrance and the reparations. So the city of Berkeley was one of the communities that joined Japanese Americans across the nation in calling for reparations. And while I was on the city council, we engaged in identifying every former Japanese American that was a employee of either our school district or our city at the point of internment, and we restored their back wages for all that we could identify and find. And so I stand in support of this. We must always remember such incidents so that we can try to not repeat the past. Thank you.
Mr. Calderon.
Madam Speaker, members, I rise briefly. Certainly not to improve on the eloquence of our speaker, but perhaps to drill down on just a few points. And starting with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights to form a more perfect union, to secure the blessings of liberty. That is who we seek to be as Americans. But it is inescapable that our institutions are as strong or as weak as the people who run them. And in this case, we were weak in terms of our institutions, but we were strong in terms of our principles. Because notwithstanding what this country did to Japanese Americans, upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, they still went to fight for those principles. They fought for what America seeks to be. And so we need to remember that today and every year at this time. Fear and ignorance is ever present. We saw it recently by a Fox News commentator about one of the most distinguished members that served in this legislature and who currently serves in Congress, was Maxine Waters. We need to fight that. irrespective of our differences, we may need to remember who we are and who we seek to be. And I think all we need to do is to look back to those Japanese Americans who had everything taken from them, but still went to fight for those principles. I ask for an aye vote.
Mr. Alejo.
Madam Speaker and members, I rise today in strong support of this resolution, and I wanted to thank our body for remembering this sad chapter in California history 70 years ago when President Roosevelt signed this executive order. It reminds us that we must remember these lessons of the past so that our nation does not repeat them ever again. When I graduated from my high school, Watsonville High, in 1992, 5 additional people joined us. They were in their late 60s because they had been deprived 50 years earlier of their ceremony to graduate and walk across the stage in front of their families. Because in April of 1942, a month before their graduation, they were stripped of their freedom, they were stripped of their liberty. Their families lost their homes, and in my area, a lot of them were leaders in agriculture. They lost their farms as well. They lost their rights enumerated under our Constitution. And at first, thousands of Japanese families living along the coast were promised that if they moved just east of Highway 1, that there would be no problems. And many did that. But soon the order came that everyone, 110,000 Japanese Americans all throughout our great state, were rounded up and put into these prison camps. In our area, they were first sent to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, and then from there put on buses to only spent several years in prison in Poston, Arizona. And so I want to really remind us, and I want to congratulate the Japanese American Citizens League, who throughout California, and especially out in the Monterey Bay, they remind Californians of all ages, especially our next generation, about this experience and this sad chapter in our state's history. And I ask for the support of this resolution today.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. It is an honor for me to rise, not only as a member individually, but as the Vice Chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus as well, to enjoy the recognition of this day of remembrance, because it is important. As they say in the field of history, those who ignore history are destined to repeat it. This clearly is an incident that we do not wish to repeat. I'm very proud of the fact that our member from Berkeley brought up the fact that African Americans were intricately involved in helping to protect the homes of those Japanese Americans from the Berkeley area during this period of time in our history. I strongly support this bill, as do the members of the Legislative Black Caucus, because this historically is the right thing for us to do. I think we grow as a state when we have these kinds of remembrances of our history. Certainly we would like to accent the positive, but again, remembering the negative helps us to grow positively. And I will just conclude with one of the statements I often talk about. King said that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, on one hand. But today I'd like to conclude on something that we must remember, which is that he said that when evil men plot, wise men and good men must plan. And I think that this resolution is the beginning of us beginning to plan to make sure that this never happens again. Thank you.
Mr. Amiano.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm honored to be a co-sponsor. You know, I came to California in the early 60s and was appalled to learn of this history, particularly through personal interactions with Japanese Americans. And when I started to teach school, we realized that this issue was not addressed in the curriculum. So 30 years later, I was on the school board and worked with a highly respected woman of the Japanese American community, the Issei generation, Kiku Funabiki, and was happy to introduce the inclusion of this terrible history into the San Francisco curriculum. And oddly enough, I still worry. I think Mr. Calderon was spot on when he addressed the horribly racist things that were said about Maxine Waters and recently Whitney Houston, and some of the pejorative and really retro, horrible comments made about Mr. Lin, who's now become a major inspiration for the Asian American community. many of these things are defended, they're said in jest, we really didn't mean it. I worry that that gets traction, and so I really take heart from the experience of the Japanese Americans and how they fought back in their way to make sure that we recognize what happened to them and that it will not happen in the future. And I am very proud of this legislature for that. So I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Dr. Halderman?
He who forgets the past is doomed to repeat it. I invite each of you to visit the Fresno Fairgrounds, which is in fact the site of a Japanese internment camp. We have one of the largest memorials to the constitutional violations against the human beings that occurred in this country, those Americans of Japanese descent who were forced there. We now recognize. On a day of remembrance that is very sacred to me, Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, we are taught to say Ani Zocheret, which is I remember. On Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day in Fresno, which is very important in our community, we're taught to say I remember. And so I appreciate the speaker's opportunity as a reminder to say on February 19th, I remember.
Mr. Nielsen.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, I shall not dwell on the tragedy. Let me dwell on the healing. The healing that came in the aftermath of that tragedy. I remember one day as a young boy, my dad saying, take the big tractor over to Benny Yamamoto's. Now, I was kind of happy because that's the first time he ever let me drive the big tractor. I said, well, why, Dad? I said, well, Benny's got to do his disking to get his crop planted. Benny was our neighbor, not long back from the camp. I believe he was at Tule Lake, trying to get himself reestablished in agriculture, and my dad was going to help him do it. I remember one morning that folks always gathered at our house for coffee in the morning, all the farmers. And one day Benny and Dad were sitting there having coffee, and Dad was writing out a check. After Benny left, I said, well, Dad, what did you buy from Benny? Oh, I didn't buy anything. He needed some money to get his seed to plant. That was the reciprocity of Dad. One night our dairy cattle got out. And when it's milking time at 2 o'clock in the morning in a foggy, cold night, and all your dairy cattle are running up and down vineyard rows, that's an arduous time. And who shows up? The entire Yamamoto family to help all of us herd those cattle back in. And further, you know, the generations that seem to repeat and seem to incessantly want to criticize their own country as the ugly Americans. I get weary of it because I think about the aftermath of World War II, one of the great tragedies of all history, one of the most brutal of all occasions in our lives, and how many lives were destroyed. What did this people of the United States of America and its leaders do in the aftermath in Europe and in Japan? We poured out our hearts to help them rebuild their countries and their economies. They were our enemies. They killed American citizens and many other things. But we are a forgiving nation. We are a good nation. That's an example, and this is a time to celebrate the goodness of human nature and how all ethnicities can get along.
Mr. Silva?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to relate a story for a couple minutes about a farmer in Fountain Valley, Orange County, Japanese descent. And I asked him, I said, what was it like in the relocation camps? And he referred to it as a concentration camp. He said he had 48 hours to vacate his property, and his family was relocated to Arkansas. And he sold his tractor to Anglo in the city of Huntington Beach for $1. And he said, when I sold that tractor, he said, I didn't think that I'd ever see it again. And he said, when I was released, I went back to that farmer and I asked him, I said, can I get my tractor back? And the farmer said, no, unless you have $1. And he said, when I got that tractor back, he said it was in a lot better shape than when I sold it. That's out of Orange County.
Ms. Yamada.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I rise in support of ACR 104 and feel deeply honored that Speaker Perez has introduced this on our behalf, and appreciate all of the comments that have been made thus far. But I rise with a point that I'd like to share as the daughter of a family who was interned. I, like Mr. Furutani, did not live in the camps, but we certainly inherited the aftermath after the release of our families and their subsequent resettlement. My family resettled in Denver, Colorado, and on a political note there was a governor of Colorado at the time during the internment, Governor Carr, who also spoke out against the internment and was a one-term governor as a result. So there are countless acts, I think, of political courage that we maybe still today are uncovering as we remember this event in California's history 70 years ago. But the note I wanted to share with all of you members is that I'm reminded that it was one of our great presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, who signed Executive Order 9066. And Madam Speaker, if I may just hold up this book, my dog-eared book, Executive Order 9066, something that I studied as an undergraduate, learning more about Asian American history in our state. That was an individual who signed the order, but it was President Ronald Reagan, a Republican, who signed the apology for the internment. And I stand here today deeply proud that as the daughter of a family who was interned, went to Union Church 70 years ago, to Santa Anita Racetrack, and lived in the horse stalls for 4 weeks before being sent on buses and trains to the Manzanar War Relocation Center or concentration camp. You may choose whichever moniker you wish. To say that that is the greatness of our country, that just a generation later, a member of this assembly stands before you as the daughter of someone interned. And I think that as we strive to make California better and our country better and our world better, it shows that when good people work together, we can make the future bright. So it is in that spirit that we remember February 19th, 1942, 70 years ago, as one of the darkest days in California history, but that it is possible for people from opposing parties to come together to achieve healing and progress. Members, I ask for your aye vote on this resolution.
Mr. Speaker, you may close.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask for your aye vote, and I ask that the first roll call be open for co-authors.
Okay, the first roll will be open for co-authors. These co-authors, members, clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Clerk will close the roll, tally the votes. For the record, there are 60 co-authors. We can take a voice vote on this item. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The measure is adopted. Mr. Alejo, you are recognized for your guest introduction.
Fellow members and Madam Speaker, as we honor the Speaker's ACR 104 to increase public awareness of the events surrounding the internment of Japanese Americans, I rise today to recognize Jack Matsuoka, a talented and distinguished Nisei cartoonist who throughout the years has used his illustrations to educate young people about a dark and regrettable period of California's history. Jack Matsuoka was born in Watsonville in 1925 and was a teenager when he was interned in the Poston camp in Arizona. When photographers were allowed in the camps, Mr. Matsuoka used his illustrations to document the struggles of Japanese Americans during the internment. Permission to use a prop, Madam Speaker? I'll take that as a yes.
Without objection.
His cartoons became famous in his 1974 book, Camp 2, Block 211. In 2003, Jack and his daughter, Emmy Young, who is with us here today, republished his book, but this time the book included a cartoon depicting the signing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, something that was a distant dream when the book first came out. Jack Matsuoka is proudly 86 years old and continues to do as much as he can with community causes. Recently, his illustrations became the inspiration for a lesson plan for 8th grade teachers to educate their students about nonviolent action for social justice issues. Unfortunately, Jack could not be with us here today, but it is my honor to present his daughter, Emmy Young, who came from Hawaii, with a resolution to recognize Jack Matsuoka's commitment to service and to educate the people of California. Joining her are some family friends from Elk Grove and high school teacher Ignacio Ornelas, who teaches his students about Jack Matsuoka's story. Please join me in honoring this great American hero, Jack Matsuoka.
So I want to thank the California Legislative API Caucus Chair, Mr. Furutani, and Speaker John Perez for bringing forward this important resolution for the Assembly observance of the Day of Remembrance. This will conclude our ceremony. We have a couple guest introductions and announcements, and Ms. Brownlee, please direct your attention to Ms. Brownlee in the rear of the chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, today the California State PTA is celebrating the National Group's Founders Day, 115 years of promoting the welfare of children and youth in school, at home, and in the community. The National Congress of Women, now known as the PTA, was founded today, February 17th, 115 years ago, in 1897, by Alice McClellan Burney and Phoebe Apperson Hearst. Back then, and still today, the PTA was concerned with the welfare of immigrants, homeless children and families, children's health and safety, the unemployed, and the uneducated. Last year, the California PTA was a close partner on a bill I carried to help parents obtain meaningful empowerment to implement reform in their own district schools. In previous years, the PTA has also worked with me for adequate school funding for education. They have supported efforts to make sure students' educational costs are fully covered so that they can have every opportunity to receive the highest quality education that we all know that every child deserves. Today, the California PTA works to raise the standards of home life and to fight for laws that ensure children a proper education, quality health care, and the opportunity to live and go to school in a safe environment. As a former PTA president, I'm asking all of you to join me in wishing the PTA a happy 115th birthday and a vibrant future to continue the fight for our children's welfare and for their education. And with me today is Carol Kosifer, California State PTA President, who is here to accept this Assembly's resolution honoring this historical and well-deserved group. Let's give them all a great hand.
So, colleagues, this concludes our business for the day. We are now going to move to adjourn in memories. And some announcements. Session schedule first is as follows. February 20th is a holiday, President's Day. February 21st, we're going to have floor session at 12 noon. February 22nd is going to be check-in session. And February 23rd is going to be floor session at 9 a.m. All other items remaining will be passed and retained. All motions will be continued. We're going to now move to adjourn in memories. Mr. Jones, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Today, the 77th Assembly District in San Diego County has lost a great philanthropist and manager and leader in our community. Les Hart was born November 18, 1952 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He grew up in Orange County and he attended Cal State Fullerton. Les Hart was involved in many community events and organizations in our area, including the El Cajon Downtown Redevelopment Corporation, the Mother Goose Parade, Lakeside Western Days Parade, the Santee Business Expo, La Mesa Oktoberfest. He was chairman of the San Diego East County Chamber of Commerce, president of the East County nonprofit Stoney's Kids, a member of the Olaf Weghorst Museum Foundation Board of Directors. He committed many hours to volunteering and supporting the Boys and Girls Club. He was a general manager and area manager for waste management in El Cajon and Santee, California. Les died in his home on February 2nd after a 4-year fight with cancer. He was only 59 years old. He was the El Cajon Citizen of the Year in 1999. He has several competitors in San Diego County that respected him as well. One of them quoted, "Mr. Hart represented a lot of the best of San Diego County region. He always made an effort to make things better. He worked so hard on so many efforts." His longtime friend and coworker, Carl Scherbaum, quoted, "Mr. Hart is irreplaceable." And I agree with those of his friends and colleagues and coworkers and other city council members and elected officials in East County that will miss Mr. Hart. He was truly irreplaceable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Please bring that name to the desk to be printed in the journal. One last quick announcement. There will be a Republican caucus upon adjournment. Republican caucus on adjournment in the rules room. So I am ready to entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Allen moves and Ms. Conway seconds that this House stand adjourned until Tuesday, February 21st at 12 noon. Quorum call is lifted.